In this YouTube video, I'm going to go on a day-by-day, blow-by-blow of what happened with New York City weather, and I'm going to challenge myself by not having a computer in front of me to seeing how much I can remember about precipitation, about temperatures, and all that good stuff to make as complete of a video as I can leading up to this point. January 1st kicks off the new year with a high temperature of 51 degrees. To continue the period of warm weather that was established at the end of December, the thunderstorms from December 31st, however, have wrapped up, leaving only a trace of rain. 0.04 inches of rain did fall in Bridgeport, but that's just Bridgeport. However, low temperatures fell down to 39 degrees. And this would be the warmest low temperature of the month. Colder air would take hold of the northeastern U.S. in particular later on in January, so this high temperature would not be repeated for 4 weeks. January 6th, you're in the depths of what really isn't a cold wave, but could have been a cold wave. Seeing as from the 4th to the 9th, every single day is a high temperature that is at maximum 33 degrees. 1 degree colder on the 4th, 5th, 7th, and 9th, and you have a cold wave. On January 6th in particular, though, the first precipitation of 2025 comes as 0.08 inches of liquid turns into 0.9 inches of snow at Central Park, the heaviest amount throughout the metro. The snow would pummel areas from Richmond to Philadelphia, but it really left New York unscathed due to the dry air. So even though there was some snow, impacts were generally minor from this storm system. After the system departed, though, from the 7th to the 9th, making the cold even worse was high winds of 35 to 45 miles an hour that constantly buffeted the New York area. And it wasn't until January 10th where temperatures would so much as so even rise to 34 degrees again. After this, you had a period of warmer-ish weather, followed by a period retreating back to cold weather. However, on January 18th, temperatures did warm up to, I believe, 46 degrees as the first rain fell. Precipitation fell on both January 6th and 0.02 inches of liquid on January 11th, but that 0.02 inches of liquid on January 11th turned into a half inch of snow from a system that mainly buffeted areas along the I-20 corridor, leaving only a tiny amount of snow further north, but it was still something. January 18th had 0.09 inches of rain. It was more significant in some parts of the metro area, but that's all there was at Central Park. It was a light day of rainfall and what should have been more significant rainfall, and it was the deepest into the year that liquid precipitation had been observed. January 19th, though, would be a much bigger weather story, seeing as what could have been New York's biggest snowstorm in 3 years happened. It was only the biggest snowstorm in 3 years, though, at LaGuardia Airport, where 3.6 inches of snow fell. At Central Park, only 1.6 inches of snow fell. So it wasn't even the biggest storm of the year. It was a major disappointment because projected liquid amounts busted and all we got was 0.26 inches of liquid equivalent. Not to mention, before the system rolled through, the high temperature did reach 41 degrees. In its wake, though, a 4-day cold wave would be established with high temperatures in the 20s or at times even in the teens. When the high temperature on January 21st was 19 degrees and the low on the morning of January 22nd fell all the way down to 10 degrees. So it was the coldest weather in New York in a few years. Colder than any day in a previous winter. Eventually, though, it would warm up into next weekend and there would finally be a stretch of warmer weather. On January 29th, the high temperature reaches 52 degrees, which was the warmest in over 4 weeks in Central Park. However, the low temperature would drop below freezing, marking yet another day with a low temperature below freezing. There hadn't been too many days with lows above freezing in New York. However, on January 31st, the low of 36 would establish itself as above freezing, and the high temperature reached 48, so one of the warmest days of January. Not the warmest, but one of the warmest. And 0.16 inches of liquid fell, which brought January's precipitation total up to 0.61 inches. Still a very, very, very low amount. However, it was no longer the driest January on record, instead only placing second driest, which was really bad when you realize October 2024, as it was the driest month on record in New York. And New York had also seen a historically dry 90-day period from August 20th through November 20th. So January did tie for the driest on record at LaGuardia Airport, despite all of that, though. On February 1st, the temperature would slide from a high of 48 degrees down to a low of 21 degrees as the temperature roller coaster began. The low fell down to 17 degrees at Central Park the next morning on February 2nd, with the high only hitting 31 degrees close to midnight. This would serve as the low on February 3rd, as the high temperature rose up to 49 degrees. The morning low on the 4th was actually above 40. If this is held, it'll be the first low above 40 all year. Nonetheless, the temperature wound up sliding back down into, I think, somewhere between 30 and 32 that night. And furthermore, an inch of snow was recorded on the night of February 2nd to February 3rd, bringing a tenth of an inch of valuable liquid precipitation. On February 6th, there would only be half an inch of snow in what was mostly slushy sleet, but that was 0.34 inches of liquid. On February 8th, there will be 3 inches of snow from 0.67 inches of liquid. So some of the most significant precipitation of 2024, and one of the biggest snowstorms of the year, with up to 4 inches in ice slip, would finally deliver. So again, we're finally getting snow here and precipitation. There would be another roughly inch and a half of snow-ish on the morning of February 12th, from February 12th, and on February 15th, there'll be another half inch of snow in what was the biggest storm system of February. 0.31 inches of rain fell down, and temperatures warmed up to 47 degrees as a more significant storm pushed 0.77 inches of rain in Central Park. A 3-day cold wave would follow this storm system. From the 18th through the 20th. So the 17th actually was still above freezing. But the 16th is when the colder air push really started to take effect. So we saw heavy precipitation. Some places saw over an inch of rain. And I believe JFK and Bridgeport both set rainfall records on the 16th. Seeing as those sites, along with ice slip, wound up having above average precipitation in February, while the other metro sites of Central Park, LaGuardia, and Newark, which weren't so lucky, saw below average precipitation. Seeing as it'll be very dry for the next few weeks, there'd be less than a half inch of snow for the final snowflakes on February 20th, with barely any liquid precipitation. And the next chance of liquid was scattered showers on February 27th, concluding the month. The month did end, however, with, I believe, 4 or 5 days with high temperatures in the 50s. And during the stretch, we also finally saw our first low temperatures in the 40s. And I really wish I remembered when, but I'm challenging myself. March 1st wound up being the first day of the year with a high in the 60s, as temperatures wound up reaching 64 degrees in Central Park. Temperatures on Long Island were mainly held to the 50s due to wind off the water. However, a near historic temperature plunge is about to occur. One of the fastest plunges in New York City history, as the temperature wound up falling all the way down to 27 degrees by midnight and 20 degrees on the morning of March 2nd, establishing the coldest morning in March in New York City since 2019. All this without any liquid precipitation. So there's no liquid precipitation, and yet you had this much of a historic slide in temperatures. Wow. The high temperature would only reach 33 degrees, which is the coldest high temperature in March in 3 years, since 2022. However, March would quickly warm up. On March 5th, a near record deluge, which probably set rainfall records at other sites in New York City. It couldn't at Central Park, but it was still 1.71 inches of rain. The most rain Central Park had seen in a single day since August 18th, when over 2 inches fell. And I don't think we've gotten higher than that since. And this came as severe storms tore through the metro area. They departed by March 6th, which brought an influx of colder air, but not as cold as what had been seen earlier in the week. Before temperatures rebounded nicely, by March 10th and 11th, temperatures were in the mid-60s, which is the warmest Central Park had seen thus far. However, it was an uneven ride. Oftentimes, after temperatures would establish themselves in the 60s, you had days that regressed back to highs of around 50 degrees, if not even in the upper 40s. However, starting on March 4th, the general trend was above average temperatures. However, this wouldn't last forever, as eventually cold air would begin to threaten in New York City, and it was starting to get more and more unable to recover. This was because March brought oftentimes significant storms to the New York metro area. Almost an inch of rain fell on the morning of March 17th, as temperatures fell from 59 degrees to 37 degrees during the day. Though after they bottomed out at 35 degrees on the 18th, the high did warm nicely back up to 61 degrees due to brilliant sunshine. On March 20th, over an inch of rain poured down at night, although much less rain fell further to the east, as the rain was mostly concentrated in a singular line. March 22nd is the day where the high temperature did in fact rise to 60. However, the cold stretch would end as the low temperature fell down to 31 degrees on the morning of March 23rd, which is below average, and the high temperature was somewhere in the mid to upper 40s. I forget what exactly it was. This did end the warm streak of 19 days, which actually mirrored a similar streak that began on March 1st last year, after February 29th, 2024 was below average with a high of 43 and a low of 31. It would mirror that stretch until March 19th came in 2024. On March 19th, 2024, the high temperature was 48 and the low was 36, which snapped that streak. After March 23rd, temperatures did mostly rebound, but slowly and with scattered progress, until we saw one of the craziest roller coasters of temperatures ever. After high temperatures of like 52 degrees on March 27th and somewhere in the mid-60s on the 28th, on March 29th, the temperature soared up to 81 degrees. The first temperature in the 80s in March in 4 years, and while it wasn't a record, due to an extraordinary heat wave in March 1998, it was still very warm nonetheless. And there was some light precipitation as this insane heat came through. However, temperatures would fall fast. After it was 79 degrees at around 5 p.m., by 6 p.m., the temperature fell to 53 degrees, one of the biggest hourly plunges in New York history. It wouldn't stop there. The temperature would fall to 43 degrees by midnight, with a low of 42 degrees the next morning, as the high temperature would only reach 48 degrees due to one of the most significant backdoor cold fronts New York City had seen in 6 years. But the fun wasn't over yet. After the low was 45 on March 31st, the high temperature would soar to 73 degrees, and there'd be more severe thunderstorms to drop another inch of rain on Central Park. April 1st, we saw temperatures be somewhat normal for the start of April, but falling with a high of 58. before the high was only 49 degrees on April 2nd with a low of 37. However, on April 3rd, after a low of 45, I think, 47 or 44, something like that, the high temperature soared to 73. Not only was it 73, it was 73 close to midnight. So you had temperatures in the low 70s in the early morning of May 4th, more typical for June. That would be the high temperature, and afternoon temperatures would stay in the mid 60s, which is still above average. And the low would only fall to 57, which was the first low in the 50s in 2025. After this, temperatures would further fall, and after temperature highs in the mid 50s on April 5th and 6th with lots of rainfall, 3/4 of an inch on April 6th alone. By April 7th, you had seen lots of rain in the past 13 days, a high of 50, but the afternoon temperatures were held to 42, and it wouldn't cross 52 degrees again for 6 days. The low temperature wound up falling to 31 degrees on April 9th, which was the first freeze in April in 4 years. More importantly, the high temperature was only 45 degrees the day before, forcing the Mets to push their game up 3 hours because of the cold temperatures. The high on April 9th did rebound to 49 degrees. On April 12th, records for cold were set at every site except for Central Park in Newark. And Central Park had a longer period of record, but they had a colder high than most of them. They were all in the low 40s, but Central Park's high was 40 degrees exactly. The coldest high temperature since the high was 39 degrees on March 3rd. The low was 36, however, which was cold, but not insanely cold. Still, though, it was one of the coldest days seen in mid-April. And between April 11th and 12th, an inch of rain fell. April 13th, however, would serve as the last day with a low temperature in the 30s, with a low of 39. The high did rebound to 58 degrees, though, as milder weather would take a hold in April for a few days before April 16th and 17th progressed with highs of 50 and 51 after lows of 44. This would mark a substantial change, though, in the weather pattern of New York. Let's go this way. This would mark a substantial change to the weather pattern of New York. On April 18th, the high reached the mid-60s after a low of 48. Then on April 19th, a record was set at LaGuardia Airport at 86 degrees. Central Park reached 85 degrees, which is the warmest temperature since August 28th of 2024. It was an extraordinarily warm day. And Easter still at a high in the 70s. After April 19th, the only day in the next 8 to not have a high in the 50s was when the high only reached 57 degrees on April 21st after a low of 50. So the lows were in the 50s this whole time until this all came crumbling down on after April 26th. The 26th itself was still warm. The 25th had a low of 60, which is a record warm low for the date. But then on the 26th, after a high of 74, the temperature crashed down to 53 degrees following severe thunderstorms. 0.61 inches of rain fell in half an hour, and 0.82 inches of rain fell in total. But it was still not enough to make April above average in the precipitation department. On April 27th, the high would only reach 59 degrees, and the low would be 48. Those seem to be the last day with a high in the 50s and a low in the 40s in Central Park of the season. But 3 weeks later, it would get to those levels again. May 3rd, after a day with a high of 85, when it was 84 the day before, severe thunderstorms tore across the metro, bringing 0.95 inches of rain in just about 40 minutes. However, there was only 0.27 inches of rain at Newark and little to none at JFK or LaGuardia. More consistent rain would come into the area, however, both on May 5th and on May 9th. Not as much rain fell in Central Park on those days, but more rain fell throughout the whole metro as temperatures cooled off into the 60s. As a matter of fact, on May 9th, the high was 60 and the low was 51. This appeared to be the coldest temperature in May, but it wouldn't be. However, it only dropped down to 50 degrees on Mother's Day weekend from the 10th through the 12th. That's all it got down to. May was mostly a bland weather month. However, there was rain frequently in the month. More importantly, though, on May 20th, at long last, the low temperature Central Park read 49 degrees, with the high of only 67 degrees. Then the rain came in on May 21st through 23rd, and over an inch of rain came down those 3 days, 0.9 inches of rain on the 22nd alone. Thus, the 21st and 22nd had back-to-back highs in the 50s and lows in the 40s. In particular, the high of 51 degrees on May 22nd was the first record cold high in Central Park since March 28th, 2022. On the 23rd, we saw the coolest temperature of the month when the low dropped down to 47 degrees and the high rebounded to 63 before more nightly storms dumped another quarter inch of rain on Central Park. The 24th, it looks like, so yesterday, will appear to be the last day with a low in the 50s with a low temperature of 48 degrees. It is looking strongly like that trend will be over as our weather reverts back to normal.